First of all, I'd like to thank the host for inviting me and for coming up with the topic. This is a topic that I had very much hoped would get a great deal more scholarly attention. So I was very excited, and that's why I decided to come. So again, thank you for both the invitation and for the idea. It's very exciting. Today I'm going to talk primarily as a historian of science and about the application of the concept Trieb in the natural sciences, in the emergent life sciences. As Marina said, this is very much in the vein of my recent book. The concept Trieb played a central role in the developing life sciences of the late 18th century in Germany. The contrast between Trieb and Kraft, Nisus and Vis, highlighted the distinctive domain of life as contrasted with more general physical-chemical forces in nature. Force, or vis, had proven the most important concept for the complication of mechanical philosophy from its 17th century premises to encompass a whole set of ethereal fluids and subtle matter, things like gravity, heat, light, magnetism, electricity, and chemical affinity that became the preoccupation of what I call experimental Newtonianism in the wake of Newton's queries to the optics of 1706. Taking these forces to be real elements of nature dramatically transformed physical theory from the model of inert mass, i.e. motion via external impact only or mechanism, to the conception of a hierarchy of attractive and repulsive forces immanently moving the natural world, which we could call vital materialism, as I and a number of my colleagues are doing. Initially, the notion of force or vis incorporated the emergent life sciences. Thus, Albrecht von Haller termed his two experimentally discriminated forms of animal physiology, irritability and sensibility, as Lebenskräfte. And this use of the word Kraft, or its Latin cognate vis, also characterized Caspar Friedrich Wolff's pioneering theory of generation in the Vis Essentialis. And indeed, the notion Lebenskraft permeated late 18th century discourse on life in Germany. And it is only in this context, I think, that we can appreciate the decisive terminological importance of Johann Friedrich Blumenbach in shifting from this notion of Kraft, vis, or force, to the notion of Trieb, nisus, drive, but also, and here for me seminally, instinct. If Haller dominated German life science from 1740 to his death in 1777, Blumenbach, another scholar from Göttingen, came to prominence for the remainder of the century and helped crystallize the emergent new discipline of biology. His long and distinguished career linked him as teacher, colleague, mentor to virtually all the important figures of the field, so that Blumenbach came to be the patriarch of German life science well into the 19th century. For Blumenbach, the question of the emergence, Entstehung, of organized bodies was, despite all the efforts of modern science, quote, one of the most difficult topics of physiology, unquote. He elaborated, quote, whence the original basic material, erster Grundstoff, of each and every animal plant arises, hervorkomme, and by what sorts of forces, Kräfte, this material is subsequently developed, ausgebildet, are each problems whose solution hitherto has been shrouded in darkness, unquote. I use all those German words here, though I'm always going to be translating everything into English, because it's exceedingly important what the key terms are through which this notion comes to become philosophically significant. The notion of Trieb, constitutive for Blumenbach's conceptual intervention, Bildungstrieb, intentionally separated this phenomenon from the other Bildungskräfte that had been identified in the physical and even the organic world. This discrimination proved important for Kant and later still for Goethe and Schelling, and that's what this conference is all about. Thus, in my particular essay, what I want to do is to try to reconstruct the source and the significance of Blumenbach's turn to Trieb. And my argument will be that Blumenbach drew upon the pioneering work of Hermann Reimarus and therefore my essay will have a tripart structure. First, I will talk about what Reimarus was doing with Trieb. We've already heard a good deal about that, and I will try to compress my remarks on that accordingly. Then I'll establish what Blumenbach personally did with Trieb in developing the concept of Bildungstrieb, and I'll end briefly with the way in which Kant received this way of thinking from Blumenbach. Unlike the previous speaker, I'm going to talk primarily about the last text from Reimarus' great trilogy of the 1750s, his Allgemeine Betrachtungen über die Triebe der Tiere, hauptsächlich über ihre Kunsttriebe from 1760. And what I want to suggest is that he undertook that work specifically to refute the Abbé de Condillac's Traité des Animaux from 1755, which sought to explain animal behavior on the pattern of human learning acquired from sense experience. And one of the things that we've begun to see in all of these discussions of Reimarus is how extraordinarily closely and swiftly he responds to French language texts. If we think about the 1754 work and its response to Rousseau, Triebe, Allgemeine Betrachtungen, is a very swift response to Condillac, and by the way, also to Buffon. What Reimarus wants to do is fundamentally dispute Condillac's central thesis that animals learned through the experience that was analogous with human development. And against this, Reimarus wanted to insist upon the innate character of animal instinct or drive. Already in the Vornehmste Wahrheiten of 1754, he offered a clear conceptualization of the essential features of the concept Trieb. It was the capacity to pursue a self-beneficial goal, quote, without any individual reflection, experience, and practice, without any training, example, or method, from birth onward, with an artfulness ready from birth that was masterful in achieving its end, unquote. And he promised that he would elaborate on this theory of Trieb in a subsequent work, and that's what Triebe der Tiere of 1760 undertook to do. What he's doing, and what we've seen in the two prior presentations, is to situate that inquiry into the general issue of the animal-human boundary and the specific issue of the nature of animal soul, which were both extraordinarily central topics for all 18th century discourse. And here is what Reimarus believed that he would be able to establish in his huge book of 1760. Quote, I demonstrate from the powers of animals and from the properties of the skillful drives, Kunsttriebe, that they do not consist in an effectiveness that the animals achieved for themselves through experience and reason, nor through any degree of reason, but that these are inherited capacities which arise out of the determinate natural powers of animals. Angeborene Fertigkeiten sind, welche aus determinierten Naturkräften der Tiere entstehen. Based on extensive documentation in animal instinctual behavior, Reimarus distinguished between general self-preservation and a more particular manifestation, which he called the Kunsttrieb, or skilled drives. And these were, in fact, his primary concern. Indeed, the notion Kunsttrieb is probably the most theoretically fruitful concept that Blumenbach, or that Reimarus contributed to the developing field. But what I want to do is get into the technicalities of how he construed this notion of Trieb. And he writes, Trieb in general is encompassing, quote, all natural efforts towards particular actions. Alles natürliche Bemühen zu gewissen Handlungen, unquote. And he characterized by Kunst all skillful activity, all, quote, regulated, rule-governed capacities for certain actions. And thus, the decisive features of the Kunsttrieb were that it was both natural and yet agential, i.e., it entailed a measure of purpose. In short, what Reimarus arrived at in his conception of animal behavior is what we could call the idea of immanent purposiveness. Again, a key term that Kant is going to be interested in. And it was purposive precisely in that it aimed, quote, at the maintenance and well-being of the animal and its species, auf die Erhaltung und Wohlfahrt des Tieres und seines Geschlechtes, unquote. It was, however, altogether innate This was his overriding theoretical insistence against people like his French rivals. All Triebe were, as he put it, endowed by the Creator, von dem Schöpfer eingepflanzt, unquote. At the close of his chapter on the Kunsttriebe, Reimarus noted, quote, "By the term skillful drives, I designate the matter itself, which is before the eyes of everyone to observe, but not the cause or the manner of its possibility. One must first come to be acquainted with the matter itself, according to its actual properties, before one can ask how all that has really been observed in animals can be possible," unquote. While the interaction between soul and body was ultimately, quote, "a mystery, and how it actually works will always be impossible for us to know," unquote, nevertheless, experience and observation made it clear that such interactions happened both in animals and humans. I take this to be exceedingly important. I suggest that precisely what Reimarus is doing here is making a discrimination between the practice of empirical scientific research into life and behavior, and philosophical speculation. And he's suggesting that indeed natural scientists do not need to be metaphysicians. I think that's very important for the future of life science, both in Germany and in the West altogether. Quoting him again, "We must thereby presume the actual connection between the soul and the body, merely according to experience, even if we cannot explain the nature of this mutual interaction," unquote. And this was a fundamental methodological maxim for empirical research science, as Reimarus believed, quoting again, "For the original essential forces are, in accordance with their regular determination, the first ground of all the actualities of nature, and all philosophers must acknowledge that it is impossible to determine a priori any further philosophical or mathematical proof concerning the fundamental forces of things and their determinate laws. But they must simply assume them in accordance with experience in order to carry on inquiry," unquote. Thus, what I want to suggest is that Reimarus, in his approach to methodology in his work on Triebe, stressed this methodological empirical response and the denigration of achieving any kind of epistemological or especially ontological resolution of these ultimate questions. And what I want to suggest is that this gives us both a substantive and a methodological key to what Blumenbach is going to want to make of the concept of Trieb in his own work. In his influential Handbuch der Naturgeschichte, with numerous editions starting in 1779, Blumenbach addressed all these crucial issues of the animal-human boundary and of the nature of animal behavior. And what I want to suggest is from the very beginning, he was drawing upon the work of Reimarus, although he only explicitly acknowledged the source of many of his ideas in later editions of the Handbuch. All of the arguments that he was using, which he footnoted in later editions, were precisely in the same language in the original edition, and they are all from Reimarus. What Blumenbach derived from his understanding, not only of Reimarus, but more generally, was that man was so radically different from everything else in the animal kingdom that even Linnaeus had gone astray in trying to create his category of primates. Man, Blumenbach insisted, had to be in a category all his own. And what determined that category that made him distinctive within the animal world? He called humans inermis, that is to say, defenseless. And what he meant by that precisely was that unlike all the other animals, he was endowed neither with behaviors nor with physical features that protected them from their environment and secured them in their ecological niche, but rather was abandoned to learning through reason. And it was reason that made up for all these weaknesses that human beings were beset by. And what Blumenbach argued was that this very weakness enabled human beings to penetrate many different environments and establish themselves throughout the natural kingdom. All of these are ideas that get picked up and developed very, very richly by Herder in other writings later, but they're already in Blumenbach in these arguments. What I want to do is see where this general concern about the nature of the relationship between human and animals leads to the Bildungstrieb. And here I need to introduce a more biographical and social scientific conception, namely Blumenbach's dread of offending Albrecht von Haller. Blumenbach worshipped Haller. He never got to meet him personally because Haller had already gone back to Switzerland by the time that Blumenbach got to Göttingen, but immediately he was put into correspondence with Haller. He idolized Haller as the great model of a scientist, and he accepted Haller's theory of preformation as unquestionably the right theory for many years. And then he began to have second thoughts. And he began to do a lot of empirical research of his own on freshwater polyps near Göttingen, and he'd begun to develop a number of reservations about Haller, but he said not a word until the grand old man died. And so the most important separation, I think, between the Blumenbach of the very, very famous dissertation of 1775 and the beginning of the Handbuch der Naturgeschichte is the death of Albrecht von Haller in late 1777, which freed Blumenbach finally to be able to spell out his own ideas without fear. And therefore, in 1780 already, in a new journal for the natural sciences that was developed by his friends Lichtenberg and Forster, Blumenbach published a pioneering essay, the first venture articulating his own theory. It was called Über den Bildungstrieb, Nisus Formativus und seinen Einfluss auf die Generation und Reproduktion. Okay. So in that very title, we already get the enunciation of a radical new set of approaches to the problems, the central problems of life science. Blumenbach had been working on those ideas experimentally for 5 years before, and it's only now in this context that he feels free to explore these ideas. What I want to suggest is that from the very beginning, he has a specific definition of Bildungstrieb that he never really alters. So this notion is fully formed for Blumenbach by the time he publishes this little essay in 1780. It's going to get tweaked and, I'm going to argue, methodologically supplemented in subsequent work, but the fundamental conception changes virtually not by a word over the course of many, many renditions of it. And he came to it, he said, not only on the basis of having worked on his beloved polyps in the aftermath of Tremblay, but also on the basis of a surgical experiment or experience that he had, namely that in dealing with a very severe knee injury, the healing process left a significant depression in the physical form, that the mass was reduced, and that somehow what he began to see was that there was a diminution in the efficacy of the living being to regenerate. Though there was clearly an effort to and a power to, it was never quite the same, of the same strength as it was in its initial formulation. And he said, from these two, I came to a general theoretical conclusion. And it's rather amazing and sweeping that this theory could be enunciated on what seems to be rather slender pillars of evidence. But nonetheless, this is what he thought he had done. That in all living creatures, from man to mite, and from cedar down to mold. Please note that Reimarus thought plants were not living things, a rather stupid position, though it follows from his metaphysics, not his biology. Blumenbach never labored under such an illusion. So here it's from man to mite and from cedar down to mold, a distinctive innate drive, Trieb, innate drive. Okay, that's Reimarus language. Okay, so he's definitely picking up from Reimarus, but he's already departing from Reimarus as a life scientist. Lies that remains actively at work over their entire lifespan, at the beginning to help them assume their definitive form, then to maintain it, and if that be destroyed, as much as possible to restore it. And here's that diminution dimension that he sees in regeneration. He goes on, a drive or propensity or endeavor, however one wishes to term it. Please be sensitive to that. We were just talking about that over the break. It's not the term that Blumenbach wants to fight about. It's the substance of the matter. It's the fact that these phenomena develop in biology. A drive that is entirely different from both the general properties of all bodies whatsoever and from the other characteristic forces, Kräfte, of organized bodies in particular, which appears to be one of the original causes of all propagation, Generation, nutrition, and regeneration, Reproduction, and which I here, in order to avoid all misinterpretation and in order to distinguish it from other natural forces, provide the name formative drive, Bildungstrieb, nisus formativus. So what Blumenbach wants to suggest here is that he's found something distinctively different that needs to be designated by a different term from all the terms used before. While it is similar to those, it is distinctive. And that distinctiveness he wants to capture in the contrast between nisus and vis. That's what's really scientifically and theoretically crucial about this innovation, and it is there from the outset. Okay? Blumenbach never deviates from that. It's the core of his conception of what he's achieved in his work, and he insists that no one else and that no other theory of life forces can really be used to characterize what he was in fact describing. What he realized as he formulated this theory of the Bildungstrieb was that he had stepped on the feet of his dear departed Haller. And so, having written this article, he started to feel very, very anxious. So anxious indeed that he decided within a year that he had to expand the article into a little book in which basically the article is replicated, but it begins with this elaborate kowtow to Haller, saying, if the great man had only lived a little longer, he would have seen it, and he would have undertaken these things. And it's not that I'm better than him, or that he was wrong, perish the thought, but that I just was able to do the kind of work that he would have done if he'd only been around longer. It's sickeningly sycophantic, okay? But it suggests the degree to which Blumenbach felt completely awed by the presence of Haller in the field. Nonetheless, and crucially, he's basically saying Haller is all wet. And he goes so far as to say that Haller, in the famous review in which he disparaged and destroyed the reputation of Caspar Friedrich Wolff, that Haller's experimental results that were the basis of his disposition of Wolff were wrong. Were simply wrong. Whereas before, he and everyone else in Germany had simply said, yes, Mr. Haller, that must be how it is. Suddenly, Blumenbach is saying he's all wet. Without, however, for once saying Wolff was right. Okay? Blumenbach never wants to say Wolff was right. And I'm going to make more of that than other people have. It's very important that Blumenbach sees his position as in rivalry with, in tension with Wolff's position from the very beginning. So it's not just that he's broken step with Haller and the Preformationists, but also that he wants to offer something that he thinks is radically different from what Wolff had done with the Vis Essentialis. And I think that that's really important because what we'll see, I think, later is how that bears upon subsequent, very controversial statements that he makes. It's only in 1782, in the second edition of the Handbuch, that Blumenbach introduces the notion of Bildungstrieb. You will not find it in the original edition of 1779, neither in Part 1, which appears in 1779, nor in Part 2, which appears in 1780. It's only in 1782 that it appears. But what's really interesting to me is that when it appears in 1782, he lifts the definitional language literally and plants it into the text with no elaboration and with no theoretical justification. What he does later in the book is he brings in a fruitful way that I think is really important, the experiments of Joseph Kohlreuter on the transformation of tobacco plants from one species into another and then back, which demonstrates species fixity is no longer an essential attribute of the animal or the physical life kingdom, and that is going to be crucial data. What's really important for me is that there is no sign in 1780, in the book of 1781, or in the adoption of this language in 1782, of any methodological or epistemological concern on Blumenbach's part. But in the third edition of the Handbuch, in 1788, we find, interestingly enough, a sudden methodological, epistemological self-consciousness. He writes, The cause of this formative drive can admittedly be so little adduced as that of attraction or gravity and other such generally recognized natural forces. It is enough that it is a distinctive force whose undeniable existence and broad influence throughout all of nature is revealed by experience, and whose constant phenomena offer a far more ready and clear insight into generation and many other of the most important topics of natural history than other theories offered in their explanation. Please understand there are 2 points here. The first point is that this is an experimental, not a metaphysical claim, and number 2, that it's a comparatively successful claim, that it's to be judged in terms of its efficacy in solving problems in life, experimental life science, not by some absolute standard of perfection or completeness. Okay? What I want to suggest is that if you study these remarks about methodology, you will see the imprint of the very phrases that I quoted from Reimarus, and that there is a clear continuity methodologically here between the conception of what empirical science can and cannot do and what the role of ontology and metaphysics is and is not from Reimarus to Blumenbach. So it's not just a question of seizing his term, Trieb, and plugging it into Bildungstrieb. It's also a methodological identification of what's possible and what's not possible for natural science. What I'm interested in is the way that this methodological reflection starts to get inflected as the editions of his texts develop from this point forward. In 1789, he writes, "The term formative drive, just like the terms attraction and gravity, etc., serve no more and no less than to denote a force whose constant effect is recognized, but whose cause, just as little as the causes of the other, nonetheless, so generally recognized natural forces, remains for us a qualitas occulta. That does not hinder us in any way whatsoever, however, from attempting to investigate the effects of this force through empirical observations and to bring them under general laws." Here, Blumenbach explicitly invokes Newton. Already with the terms attraction and gravity, you can presume the Newtonian presence, but here there's an explicit methodological kowtow to Newton. And there have been a number of really fine essays demonstrating the virtual ubiquity of this recourse to Newton and to Newton's abstinence from offering a causal account of gravity, and the contention that if he can establish and define in very good generality the empirical reality of gravity, he doesn't need to supply a causal explanation. This is precisely the kind of argument that the most important empirical research in the 18th century invokes in all these fields about subtle matter and about these emergent forces. So what I want to suggest here is that Trieb is very much part of a substantial development in the progress of the natural sciences towards a certain kind of autonomy from metaphysics and ontology on the one hand, and towards a certain kind of internalist, relativist standard of successor efficacy. And I think it's really important that Blumenbach continually argues about the generally recognized character of these forces. No one, he says, is going to tell me there's no such thing as gravity. So what is this bullshit you want to bring to me that we can't talk about the life forces? Okay? There is no fundamental epistemological hiatus between the empirical observations on the one and the empirical observations of the other. And that is really crucial, and it's something that I think troubles me very much about the Kantian view, but we'll hear more about that from colleagues later. I think what's important to ask is, do we see in Blumenbach any equivocation about the adequacy of his theory in its empirical character, even by the end of the 1780s? And I think the answer unequivocally is no. So what is it that begins to make him nervous? I think 2 things happen, and I think that they're very important to distinguish. First of all, I think he gets challenged very aggressively by Caspar Friedrich Wolff. Wolff invites him, this is kind of sneaky, Wolff invites him to the Academy in St. Petersburg to investigate the question of nutrition as a life force. And he invites Blumenbach, a couple of other people. He gives the prize to Blumenbach, but to somebody else as well. And then he publishes those 2 papers, prize-winning papers, with an addendum, a paper by himself twice as long as either of the papers, basically arguing that neither one is as good as his own theory. I want to suggest to you that by 1788, 1789, Blumenbach is faced with the challenge of Wolff's alternative theory, and it frightens him. Why does it frighten him? What's troubling him about it? And how does that get reflected? My answer is that what troubles him about it, interestingly enough, is not method, it's metaphysics. What he's frightened by in Wolff is what he sees as materialism. What he sees as a continuity between the physical chemical forces on the one hand and the life forces on the other. This, for him, is very frightening for a set of, I would argue, metaphysical more than methodological reasons. And it is this, precisely this, that Kant loves about Blumenbach, and that Kant picks up in Blumenbach, and that makes Blumenbach feel even more secure. So that if we look at the second edition of the Bildungstrieb essay, Blumenbach makes this avowal. It's a really passionate avowal in which he says, no one believes more firmly than I in the difference between organic matter and mere physical matter. So he jumps on the bandwagon of anti-hylozoism, which is a core concept in Kant, going way back, and basically insists that his whole theory of a Bildungstrieb is about the nature of organic matter. It has nothing to do with the transition from physical matter to organic matter. There is no continuity in nature. There is a radical discontinuity. And what I want to suggest is that this is precisely what Kant wants from Blumenbach and what Kant takes from Blumenbach. And what I want to contend to you further is that the very elements that Reimarus identified as core to Trieb, the notion of immanent purposiveness, which is also a core notion in Blumenbach's Bildungstrieb, while it works as an empirical observational stratagem and even as an empirical result, has a whole bunch of metaphysical and epistemological issues built around it that Blumenbach never addresses, but that Kant, in fact, assumes, I argue, a little too readily. And that division between the physical nature of forces and the distinctive character of Triebe as ontologically grounded in some separate order of organic matter becomes the basis whereby Kant argues that there can never be a Newton of the blade of grass, and whereby he argues that the life sciences are a project that can't ever be successfully accomplished. Both arguments, I believe, were immediately rejected by all of his successors, both in philosophy and in life science. I hope to see whether that belief is confirmed or rejected in the papers that come after mine. But it's certainly my argument that the path that Kant was proposing is not the path that led to the success of the life sciences in Germany or in the Western world generally. Thank you very much.